All right. This is episode 1 of the Pythian podcast. Um, I'm Dylan Callahan of Sicilian Lodge and the Future Damascus Lodge, Knights of Pythias. And I'm joined by Casey Pemberton. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Casey.
I am Casey Pemberton. I am the current Chancellor Commander of Sicilian Lodge and future member of Monotol Lodge, whenever it exists.
Yeah, and we talked about what Pythian news we might bring up during the podcast. And I guess the most pressing and important local Pythian news would be that we have 2 lodges upcoming. One of them has a date of institution. That would be the lodge which I am founding, Damascus Lodge number 445 in the state of Kansas, here in Emporia, Kansas. The institution date has been set for October 3rd. And so all of the VIPs have been informed. We're going to be meeting about 11 o'clock in the morning. We'll probably be done around midnight sometime the next week. I think there's going to be a lot going on that day. Have you, Casey, made any further progress with Monotol Lodge?
We've just gotten all of our people gathered together. For anyone who's wondering, you need about 10 people to create a lodge and have the proper slate of officers. More than that's always wonderful. We've got all of our people arranged and have begun talking to them. We're still trying to arrange our meetings because you have to have a couple of pre-meetings before you can put in things to get your date of institution.
Definitely. That was something that has come up a few times. You know, how many pre-meetings are we supposed to have? Who has to be there and all of that. The more pre-meetings you have, the better, honestly, but that's very difficult in this COVID world that we live in. So yeah, I think we can just go ahead and get right on into it. Casey and I decided really early on that we wanted to come out of the gate swinging. So our first few podcasts are going to take on some bigger picture subjects. And I think that's what we like to talk about. We like to talk about big picture things and important things. And so Casey and I decided that the first episode should be on the subject of Pythian charity. What is meant by charity, what charity looks like, and all of that. And I think this was sort of an easy one for me, simply because it was fresh on my mind. For Sicilian Lodge number 39, based out of Independence, Missouri, where I'm the current prelate, I'd been asked by Chancellor Commander Casey Pemberton to come up with some education topics. So I wanted to tackle what is meant by Pythian charity. I think it's something that in Pythianism is perhaps misunderstood, and I don't want to, because I haven't really talked to a lot of the older members of our lodge about this directly. It's just something that, comes up in the normal course of business, when you talk about being, as we often say, a charitable organization. And I think that's even how we're legally defined in part, a fraternal benefit and charitable society. Sometimes the exact definition of what do you mean by charity, that doesn't often really come up in the normal course of conversation. I mean, everybody knows what charity means. But also something that I know both of us had noticed, and I'll pass it on to you, Casey, if you would. I've noticed that there's a lot of conversation among my Freemason friends about what does charity mean exactly. So before we get into the Pythian meaning of charity, across the board in other fraternal organizations, Casey, would you talk a little bit about what fraternity mean, or what charity means in other fraternal orders?
Sure. As Dylan mentioned, just to throw my qualifications on this one out, I'm also Worshipful Master of California 183 in California, Missouri, Masonic Lodge, and I would say they have similar meanings if you go back to the root of it, which this is kind of going to overlap. The root of it is really what is meant by Christian charity. Both organizations, especially Masonry, however, came about in a world where you didn't have to ask, is the Bible true? It was a predetermined fact among people. So, with that as the idea, Christian charity was what people thought of when they thought of charity. Now, as a part of that, there is the extension of philanthropy, you know, specifically among brothers, helping a fellow brother out. But there's also that extension of grace and forgiveness, a willingness to understand that sometimes we as men fall, we falter, we're not perfect, and we don't seek perfection. We don't ask, rather, for other men to be perfect because we know we're not.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm not in Odd Fellows or any of the other organizations, obviously, but I would imagine that would be a fairly common thread. I would also mention, as Dylan said, we haven't actually talked to a lot of the older members about what they mean by charity. But I will say, certainly, I think the world at large confuses charity and philanthropy. And I think we have, as a society, meaning the Pythians, we've advertised ourselves as more of a philanthropy, and that's what we mean by charity, even if the majority of our members don't think that's the only definition. That seems to be what's advertised.
I completely agree. It does seem to be what's advertised, and I certainly hope that, I mean, obviously, one of the main reasons that, as I mentioned before, you had asked me to come up with some education topics is not for me or any of the other members who obviously have not been a member of the Knights of Pythias for 40 years or more. It's not for me to stand at the front of the room and give a sermon on, you know, what I think something means, and then sit down and then we close the meeting and move on. It's absolutely to open up conversation and discussion right then and there to talk about what our shared experiences are with our ritual and with even the non-secretive teachings and things. And I think it's super important that we open up dialogue and see where ritual, reality, you know, theory and practice, where they all meld and where they diverge. And you mentioned philanthropy and charity and helping others out and relief and things like that. It's hard to know sometimes. I don't know if this is in all languages, but certainly with English, sometimes the same word has different meanings and different words have the same meaning. So really what I wanted to nail down with this subject of charity was what exactly is meant by charity as it is used in the Knights of Pythias. And as you said, I have an inkling, because I'm not a Freemason and I'm not an Odd Fellow, I am only a Knight of Pythias. I have an inkling that there will be largely just similarities, more similarities than dissimilarities with the different fraternal orders and their use of the word charity. So I think I'll go ahead and get right on into sort of where I'm coming from first before I get into it. When I decided to take on the subject of what is charity, I went right to the ritual and I started going through what exactly is taught about it. And some consistency came forward in what it is and also in exactly what it isn't. And it was almost surprising the level of detail given to exactly what it is, the level of definition I was able to find. So first of all, what I did was I did a lot of research and came up with, I think, a solid, short, probably 5-minute presentation on what charity is in the context of Pythianism, but also outside of it. So I was able to find that during the mid-19th century, there was a really strong, in Europe, there was a really strong chivalric ideological metaphor that was based on writings by Paul, the apostle. You'll probably recognize, stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, having on the breastplate of righteousness, feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace, shield of faith, helmet of salvation, sword of the spirit, all that good stuff. Well, that really exploded in iconography during the mid-13th century, the height of chivalric Europe. There was one in particular, I suppose it's famous among art historians. It was the first time I'd ever seen it a few weeks ago now, but a painting of the Miles Christianus, the Christian soldier allegory. And it shows a soldier riding a horse, a cavalryman, a knight, and his armor and accoutrements are all labeled. And his helmet is the hope of future bliss. His shield is the shield of faith. His chainmail armor is charity, or in the original Latin in which it was inscribed, caritas. He also has a lance, that's perseverance. The sword is the word of God. So there's a lot of similarities and some additions to, I would say. Interestingly, the horse is bona voluntas. And this is where I realized that benevolence is an Anglicization of the Latin bona voluntas, meaning goodwill, benevolence. So his horse is benevolence, and the saddle is Christian religion, for example, and the saddle cloth is humility. So every little bit and piece has some virtuous application. Interestingly, some of them I really do like. For example, the reins are discretion. His spurs are discipline. And I think that really paints a very interesting, it's an interesting painting in your mind of what exactly is discipline. It's spurring you to do what it is that you're supposed to do. The reins, you're reining yourself in. Because really, if you think about it, the horse and the rider are one unit. When you're thinking of cavalry or the knight in general, the horse and rider, the horse is taking you where you need to go. And you have to have control and discipline. And in this example, the horse's four hooves are delight, consent, good work, exercise, everything has a label. So narrowing in and focusing in on one of those things, the chainmail armor of charity, I found it interesting. I found it of note that even the four hooves are labeled. They're not just, oh yes, and all the four hooves are this one thing. Each one has its own label on it. So I think it's especially important to single out something like charity and see what it exactly is meant. So if you look at what our order's ritual gives, there are a few things. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to get into the particulars of it, but when it comes to ritual, if you had a dictionary, you could not define a word the same as you could as with an example. Because with ritual, you get emotion, you get interactivity, it's impressed on you, the definition of a word, so to speak. And that's something that a dictionary simply cannot do. So again, without getting into the particulars, the word is transmitted to you. You experience it. You're given example. And that it's something that sticks with you. And that's where I came into this with a bit of confusion, because it's not the traditional meaning of charity as we probably have come to know it since 18th, 19th, 20th century. It's not philanthropy. The lesson that's taught is not one of philanthropy. It's exactly as you described, Casey. It's that lesson of extending, well, actually, I'll just go ahead and skip down to the bottom of my presentation here. And it's exactly how it's described by Paul the Apostle when he says, though I speak with the tongues of men and angels and have not charity, I'm a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. And that's something that comes up a lot in Pythian writings, not being a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. Though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and I have all faith so that I can move mountains, but I have not charity, I am nothing. And so really, you know, there's a lot of things charity isn't. Though I would bestow my goods, all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profits me nothing. That is where it got me. Because you just define charity as not being charity, you know, in my mind. He described philanthropy as not being charity. So what is charity instead? According to the Apostle Paul, charity suffers long and is kind. It envies not, vaunts not itself, is not puffed up, does not behave itself unseemly, seeks not her own, is not easily provoked, thinks no evil, rejoices not in iniquity, but in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. It never fails, even if prophecies fail, even if tongues cease, knowledge will vanish away, but now abideth faith, hope, and charity, these three, and the greatest of these is charity. So that was my presentation in a nutshell. And obviously in Lodge meeting, I'll be able to get into a bit more detail with what exactly the ritual gives as examples and shared experiences of charity. But
that's really good. Going back to the Masonic side of it, public knowledge, we do have a similar explanation as what was just presented there with faith, hope, and charity, and it goes into the explanation of, because faith is rewarded, faith loses its power when fulfilled, when given sight. Hope seeks and finds its fulfillment, but charity extends forever.
yeah.
Of the three, charity is the only one that never has an end.
That is a solid point. And I also think it's something interesting, conversations I've had with a lot of folks on the subject of how far is too far, like in the example of what charity isn't. So maybe this isn't the perfect example, but Paul's talking about you can give all your goods to the poor and you can give your body to be burned, and that's still not charity. It does come to mind, how far is enough when it comes to charity? And that is something that the Knights of Pythias does address. It is not that in order to be a Knight of Pythias, you have to swear that, yes, at the first opportunity that I can sacrifice my life, I'm going to do it. That's not a requirement of our order. And so a question I had that was immediately answered was, okay, well, how far should I extend charity here? If you define charity as the extent to which you will look past faults, look past a situation, and remember why you're here, remember who your brothers are, remember your relationship to society itself. I think the answer to that question is pretty plainly spelled out, and that is, you extend charity to the extent to which you would, were you in their situation, you would want it extended to you. And
Indeed.
sometimes that's a long distance, and sometimes it's maybe not so far.
I had read through the document that you had sent me a while back. Pythian knighthood, its basis, ends, and principles.
Yes.
Really, really good. I don't know if it can just be found online, but really good document. And he has a very, very long explanation on charity.
It's awesome.
It is. But a few points that stuck out for me. Charity is not mere benevolence. Dictionaries may thus define it, but it is not that. A man may be benevolent, yet exceedingly uncharitable to others, who may chance to differ from him in either belief or station. And in thinking about it with that, really, I think growing up, I've always been given two definitions of charity. I just never paid attention to one of them. Because I can always remember being told to be charitable towards others and how they're acting, and understand that they're different, they have different thoughts, etc. But that's never the idea that really stuck with me. What always stuck with me was benevolence, because that's how the wider world generally uses charity.
Agreed.
I also got a few things pulled up. So not going to read the whole thing on here, but Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica, he writes on charity, and one of the questions he writes is in Article 7, is any true virtue possible without charity? To which he says, gives three objections to why people may say it is, but on the contrary, the apostle says in 1 Corinthians, exactly what you had just said, if I should distribute all my goods to the poor, and if I should deliver my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. And yet true virtue is very profitable. According to Wisdom 8:7, she teacheth temperance and prudence and justice and fortitude, which are such things as men can have nothing more profitable in life. Therefore, no true virtue is possible without charity. I think that's an interesting idea that, and yeah, Paul said it too, and what you had read out. Nothing in life, we have no profit, we have no true virtue or anything unless we start with charity. And he even gets into something that I'll cover partly in a later when we talk about friendship, to go so far as to claim that charity is the prerequisite for friendship even.
And it kind of builds on each other, because we have three ranks, and they definitely build on each other. And that's something that, he does get into in his, it's an address. They definitely build on each other, so that I like how charity is very central to the order. And you mentioned friendship. There are also three different kinds of friendship that he defines. One is a friendship of utility, which is you're friends with somebody because they're your coworker, or you're working on a project with them and you get along quite amicably with them. That's an example of a friendship of utility. Another friendship is a friendship of pleasure, where you have a shared hobby or interest, or something like that. You're friends with them because you happen to like them, or you happen to like something in common. But there's another kind of friendship, and to be honest, I forget exactly what he labels this one, but it's more of a self-sacrificing, a Pythian friendship, honestly. And that is the sort of friendship, it's disinterested. If they never did a thing for you, you'd still be friends with them. That sort of a friendship that is the highest form, a friend that you would give your life for. That is the sort of friendship that is the highest form and is really inculcated by the Knights of Pythias. And following that, if you cannot exercise charity towards a Pythian friend, then you do not have Pythian friendship, and you're not ready for that level of intellectual uh, advancement, honestly. Having friends of utility and friends of pleasure, those are good things. It's not like those are lowly concepts. Those are good things. And you can't learn, I would say, you can't learn Pythian friendship unless you first have those, um, I hesitate to call them lower forms, but in an intellectual sense, the having friends of utility and pleasure are, I would say, closer to the base of mankind. You know, it appeals to instinct, I suppose, more than higher thought. But you can't understand a friendship of like a Pythian friendship unless you understand those more base levels, I would say. And for sure, you couldn't possibly understand the true meaning of charity, which is to decide. It's a decision, it's a choice. I've decided to accept them for who they are, which is not to say that you do not want to see them further advance or that they can do no wrong in your eyes, but it is to say that it's a commitment to work with them and help them and be there for them.
Yeah. The friendship you weren't able to think of, actually, his name for it is perfect because of what we were just talking about with charity being the root of all virtue.
Hmm.
It's called the friendship of virtue.
The friendship of virtue. There you go.
Which is built upon disinterested love.
And it really is. And in our modern society of Facebook friendships, there's, you know, I don't know about, I don't know, there's a lot of different reasons you might be friends with somebody on Facebook. You might be friends with somebody simply because they sent you a request or what have you, but it's those sorts of friendships that I think are sometimes too easy to throw away. So this sort of teaching is, I think, really apt for our day and age.
Agreed. We live in a day and age where the easiest thing in the world is to throw out whatever opinion you have and get rid of whoever doesn't agree with it.
Right.
It becomes too easy to do that now with everything moving virtual. There is something to knowing that, well, this person, I'm going to have to talk to this person face to face.
Mm.
Whereas otherwise, a lot of times in today's society, I just have to deal with them on Facebook. Well, I'll block them and be done with it.
It's easy.
Yeah, I did that for quite some time.
Same. Yeah, but I mean, from a fraternalist perspective, imagine you did that. You know, you had some knockout, drag out, YouTube comment section argument with somebody you attend lodge with, and you block them. You never want to see them again, except there they are at lodge, and oh, this is awkward. Fraternalism kind of makes you want to avoid those sort of awkward situations, not like you're hiding your opinion from anyone. And that's something I think I still need to work on, finding that balance of knowing how to maybe not compartmentalize, but remember why I'm friends with a certain person or other. And most recently, that has led me to stop posting so much on what my personal political opinions are on a given subject if it's particularly divisive. Like if I know that there's a contingent of my friends who would disagree with me, I'm not going to throw that in their face and make them think that I don't care that we have a disagreement on that. I'll just choose, and this is me personally, this isn't something that is necessarily taught, but it's a lesson that I think I've learned. I do not choose to just ramble on in public about my musings on the latest political topic. There's no point to it. I have changed minds in the past, so I'm not going to say I don't change minds. I have changed minds in the past. but I think that sort of thing more often than not is going to harm potential friendships and harm potential changing of minds. If you have a friend who disagrees with you, and yeah, maybe you know they disagree, but you just don't talk about it, they're more human to you. And I think that's just a natural human thing, that people who disagree, but you know, we don't have to fight about it. They become more human, and you see where you have more similarities than dissimilarities.
Yeah. I think a huge problem, I would say probably, in modern talks with each other, and maybe even partly the reason politics has gotten as divisive as it has, is the lack of fraternalism in the modern day.
Mm.
Fraternalism holds you to a higher social standard because, like we just talked about, you can't have those knockout, drag out fights with someone when tomorrow you're going to have to go see them at lodge and break bread together, and it'll just make everything that much more awkward.
Mm-hmm.
You have to actually be able to sit down and have a reasoned discussion with them and explain why you believe what you believe, because you're going to have to deal with them in the future.
And if
And it's
that's not
going
something that you want to do, then don't. Don't talk
yeah,
about it.
I think there's obviously time and a place for everything, and I think one thing fraternalism definitely helps with is figuring out where that time and place is.
Mm-hmm. I think the flip side of this, talking about what charity isn't and what it isn't, is benevolence. You cannot have benevolence without charity. And if you have charity without benevolence, you don't really have charity. And that's something that I don't think we've mentioned the man's name yet. Reverend L.V. Price, in his address, Pythian Knighthood, Its Basis, Ends, and Principles. And I think you did ask if it's available online. You really do have to dig around for it. I found it in the book Pythian Knighthood, which you can get through the Library of Congress online. And just dig around for that, L.V. Price. But I think the time and a place, like you just said, the time and the place for benevolence. I don't think there's ever a bad time to give what you can. There will be some times when you cannot give. Cannot give money, especially, is what I'm thinking of. I think there are a lot of times that you could give time, you could give efforts, you could help out in other ways. I think there's always a way you can help out a cause. If you can't personally, you can find somebody who can, that sort of a thing. But where I'm going with this is, I think, this is a personal opinion, as all opinions here are, I think we took the time and the place for benevolence too far to a degree. Specifically when we started losing castle halls. We had the Springfield Pythian home, very famous landmark in Springfield, Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
Various other beautiful buildings. And some of them, maybe they aren't castle structures, but, they're large lodge halls. And they're spaces where people can meet or have a business. A lot of the time, most of the time, I think, lodges, castle halls were the second or third story of a larger building that housed a business or a library or something like that. And round about the time that we started not being able to afford, for various reasons, obviously lack of membership is a big one, when we could no longer afford castle halls, I think that's when we should have noticed, maybe our focus needs to be more about having that sort of benevolence with each other. And when we're no longer able to meet the needs of our own brothers, I think it's then time to stop looking for new outlets to give time, energy, and money, and start looking at the outlets you have. I'm not saying there should have come a point where we stopped giving to a certain philanthropic cause. I'm not saying that even. I'm saying we have continued to advance, finding newer and differenter places to give money and time and energy and advertisement and things. And at the same time, our own order has suffered so greatly. Our numbers are nowhere near where they were just 50 years ago, 50 or 60 years ago.
I would say our numbers are probably nowhere near where they are 20 years ago. Yet, if you looked at our giving, it hasn't changed much. And that's a huge problem. He is a political guy, but Morton Blackwell, a person who I respect a lot, has a great quote on this. You can't change the world if you can't pay the rent. And, I think that's a thing we haven't really come around to think about in our order. I think we are, but I don't think we came around to it quick enough. And that cost us, as you were talking about, a lot of great buildings. And really, that cost us not free, but reduced price advertising by not having those buildings. Because if you don't have the building with your symbols on it, how are people supposed to know you exist?
Exactly. There are some people who don't know it exists until they ask about what the building is. I spoke to somebody just, I think, about a week ago now, who said, yeah, I lived down the street from a castle, but I never knew really what it was or why it was there, because it wasn't in use as such. It didn't say Knights of Pythias on it. It was just a castle hall building, and it is what it is. When you're a little, I think she said she was 10 years old when they moved away, and nobody ever really talked about it because it wasn't active, it wasn't used, and they didn't advertise.
Yeah, I think one of the greatest mistakes that has been made, and this, again, personal opinion, is we let our focus on helping every cause we could outside take over our focus, our internal focus. And it hasn't been helpful to the growth of membership. The Knights Templar, they're a very, very obviously famous historic chivalric order. They took vows of poverty, but they still had wonderful buildings. They still had wonderful castles because they recognized that they needed them. I think there's a balance, and I think we've way overshot it to one end, and I'm hoping we don't overshoot it to the other.
Indeed.
But for a time, we may have to.
And you and I have talked about the necessity for having a simple space, a building where a brother can come and, there's a small apartment, like a little hotel room in there.
If nothing else, there's a place where they could put a cot and eat. If nothing else, a place where a visiting brother just could definitely find a spot to lay their head. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important because you never know what can happen.
And just to bring it back around to charity, this whole time we've been talking about benevolence. You can't have benevolence without charity. And charity is that reaching out to a brother who has shortcomings, whether they're personal character shortcomings or they're literally shorter on their budget this month. That's the sort of charity that is meant by friendship, charity, and benevolence.
Indeed.
All right, well, any final thoughts on that?
None that I can think of, except, let me see real quick. I'm sure I can grab a great quote out of here to wrap us up. What do we mean by charity? What is it? Is it something simple, something capable of being a practical working virtue in a mixed society? Is the virtue possible alike to sinners and saints? The kind of charity needed but in our order is that which will serve men in his associations with men of unlike temperaments, holding unlike opinions on many grave questions, and strongly competing for honors or vantage ground in life. Evidently, a working charity therefore differs somewhat from the ideal of the philosopher, the poet, or preacher. It is a virtue possible to all alike. That is, again, from that same document by Reverend L.V. Price.
It's good stuff.
It is.
All right, well, that was episode 1, podcast 1 of the Pythian podcast. I think we'll figure out what controversial subject we'll come up with the next time, but thank you for listening. And a major difference I might add here at the end between the Knights of Pythias and the Freemasons is that we do recruitment drives. So if you're interested in joining the Knights of Pythias, we're based out of Kansas and Missouri, so you can always check out MissouriPythians.org is our website and find more information on the order and how to join. If you're in any other state, just simply do a Google search for Knights of Pythias in your state, and you should be able to find a Grand Lodge website. And that is all.